Hello everyone, so I'm happy to say that the Cryolophosaurus is now finished today, and while we make this dinosaur, one could say, we'll be learning some fun facts along the way. Hello everyone, hope you're all doing well, and thank you for tuning into Moose Motion. Be sure to like the video if you enjoyed the content, comment below what you think, share with your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing if you're new, and be sure you have your post notifications turned on so you don't miss any of the new content. Anyway, thank you for your support, it's highly appreciated. Welcome to part 2 of the Cryolophosaurus project, everyone. So last time we basically left off while making a armature doll skeleton with basically no flesh. During this video, we're going to, start off by painting a couple things because it's just a lot easier to do that before we add a whole lot of clay, and then add some plasticine, which is my personal favorite part about these things, but generally can take a little bit more time than expected. And with this dinosaur, I went with a full set of feathers, so yeah, that unfortunately did put me behind schedule as well, but personally, I think it was well worth it in the end, especially considering, it's an Arctic dinosaur and it probably needed the extra insulation. So, before we dive too heavily into the science or fun facts about this dinosaur, I will recommend that you go check out part 1 because, during that video we obviously cover quite a lot of the basics essentially, and during this one we'll be going a little bit more heavy into the genera, for example. And, for those of you who are curious about making your own little Cryolophosaurus, there's plenty of text for you to follow along on basic instructions on what I'm essentially doing during the video. Alright, now it's time to nerd out and talk about some, fun facts about Cryolophosaurus. First, I will give a quick overstatement for, people who maybe weren't quite fully paying attention last time and or too lazy to go see part 1. Cryolophosaurus was a large theropod dinosaur that lived in Antarctica 199.3 to 182.7 million years ago during the early Jurassic. It was about 6 to 7 meters long, about 2 meters tall, and weighing in at about 350 to 465 kilograms, and for you American viewers, that's approximately half a ton. Its name translates to cold crest lizard, and or it's also known as the Elvis dinosaur, or Elvisaur. Now that we got a basic picture or a quick recap on this dinosaur, it's time to dive into some more, heavy fun facts about this, very unique Antarctic dinosaur. Now, the first thing we're going to really dive in deep about is its genera, or its, family tree, essentially. As Cryolophosaurus being one of the first large early theropods, it's important to understand their early diversification. When it was first described, Cryolophosaurus was classified as an early member of a variety of derived theropod clades, ranging from Allosauridae to Ceratosaura. It was also sometimes considered to be a member of the clade Dilophosauridae, along with some other large crested species, such as Dinosaurus, Dracovenator, and Dilophosaurus itself. There were 2 reasons why Cryolophosaurus was initially so difficult to basically land in a proper clade. First, it has a mixture of basal and derived theropod features. Second, several decades ago, the classifications for early theropods was, rather flawed. While technically speaking, Cryolophosaurus was closely related to the members of the Dilophosauridae family, however, Cryolophosauridae is not a true clade. Instead, it turned out to be a grade of early theropods. That bridged the gap from small Coelophysis-like species from the early Triassic to the early Jurassic, and 2 more derived theropods that dominated after. Although Cryolophosaurus was not among these derived theropods. However, it is among one of the closer living relatives to the Avarostria, which happens to have some species among those derived theropods. Some of these Avarostria species include Abelisaurs, Spinosaurs, and birds. It was also the only clade of theropod dinosaurs that survived into the Cretaceous period. This means Cryolophosaurus was very closely related to basically all your big famous dinosaurs that survived into the Cretaceous period. This also means the long-distant relatives of birds were also very similar to Cryolophosaurus himself. It should be noted that, since Dilophosaurus was even more closely related to the true Avarostrians than Cryolophosaurus was, it's unlikely that the ancestors of birds had Cryolophosaurus's distinct pompadour crest. Now that we've discussed the, well, confusing lineage of this dinosaur, of where it belonged to at one point and where it belongs now, we will discuss a little bit more about, well, the actual climate that it would have lived in. There's a few different things that I've, well, kind of picked up since then and didn't have time to discuss last time, and as well, I took some of the beauty shots, well, in my backyard, and I'm Canadian, so there's a lot of snow, so it should probably be discussed before someone in the comments is all like, well, there probably wouldn't have been that much snow. So, anyway, let's talk about the climate for Cryolophosaurus. During the early Jurassic, the Antarctic probably wouldn't have been nearly as cold as it is now, being that it was much closer to the equator. It wouldn't be exactly a barren wasteland like we know it now, it probably would have been closer to, well, southern Chile. That all being said, it still would have been the coldest continent, well, or part of Pangaea in this case, I suppose, in that timeline, so definitely was not a warm place to be. I think the average temperature from my sources would have been about 10 degrees Celsius. And the closer you got to the center of that continent, well, I mean, I guess it technically wouldn't have been really a continent at that point because it was still part of Pangaea, but Pangaea was just starting to break up at that point. At any rate, if you got closer to the center of Antarctica during the Permian period, it would basically get colder. Now, saying all this basically means there probably was some snow, but nowhere near to the extent that we think of it now. Now, all that being said, there would have been basically some extreme, well, climates, obviously, during this time period as well, given the fact that Antarctica was still basically at the bottom of the Earth. Now, due to its geographic location, Antarctica generally has very, very odd, summer and winter timelines. Basically, it'll go 6 months out of the year with complete sunlight where the sun never goes down, and then 6 months of complete darkness. And it's assumed that these dinosaurs were probably living in a similar climate at that time, so yeah, it probably wasn't a very easy place to live. Given the fact that it's just kind of cold and miserable all the time, like Canada is most of the time, and I'm kind of sick of winter at this point personally, and it's maybe having a slight effect on me at this point. Any rate, and then there's the fact that, well, 6 months out of the year, basically there's no photosynthesis going on whatsoever because there's no daylight for the plants, so I can imagine for some of these herbivores it wouldn't have been exactly very easy either. Now, one more interesting thing basically about, well, perhaps the size of these dinosaurs in Antarctica in comparison to the rest of the globe, because, well, a lot of them are quite large, especially for that time period. Now, this can be actually quite easily explained, considering, well, we're just going to use essentially modern-day animals to help explain this. Now, generally speaking, most animals that live in extremely cold climates, such as Antarctica or North Pole, they are generally a lot larger than some of their counterparts, mainly because, well, large bodies tend to, well, lose less heat. So when you're living in a very cold place, it probably pays to be slightly larger, so that way you're not fighting to keep as, well, much heat and losing as much energy to just the elements at that point. And that is why, well, Cryolophosaurus, among with the other Arctic dinosaurs during the early Jurassic, were assumed to be quite a bit larger than their counterparts, mainly because it was just slightly more beneficial given the climate that they lived in. This is also known as Bergmann's rule, so that's another way to sum basically everything I set up in a matter of seconds. Now, one other thing we should probably briefly touch up upon, even though I kind of touched it up in part 1, is, well, feathers, mainly because, well, I'm adding them onto the sculpture at the moment, so we may as well talk about them just a little bit. Now, this goes back to kind of the beginning lineage of Cryolophosaurus, due to it being related to Coelophysis. Given the environment that Coelophysis lived in, as well as its metabolism, it would have required a partial covering of feathers, basically just to stay alive. Therefore, at least the direct ancestors of Cryolophosaurus did indeed have feathers, therefore leading it to, well, obviously being probably more prone to having them. However, the overall body size of Cryolophosaurus is slightly counterintuitive to this, well, hypothesis. Due to the fact that, well, generally speaking, larger body-sized animals don't lose as much heat, generally speaking, because, well, they're larger. Therefore, they generally have a lot less insulation than their smaller relatives. A good example of this in modern day terms would be, well, an elephant. Considering it is a mammal, it does have hairs, but it is covered in very, very little hairs. And, well, one could also point out the extinct mammoth, given the fact that that thing lived in a colder climate and was very large and actually did have fur. So that kind of leans us towards a few other obvious, well, hypothesis or estimations about whether or not Cryolophosaurus did indeed have feathers. One other good example for modern day animals that I can think of real quick here is obviously the large tropical birds. Generally speaking, a lot of the large tropical birds, such as ostriches that live in warmer climates, generally don't need as much feathers. However, the best example for Cryolophosaurus in regards to dinosaur terms is Eutyrannus, which is the largest dinosaur that is confirmed to have feathers. And notably, it is larger than Cryolophosaurus. And one other thing that should be mentioned is that it also lived in a fairly cold climate, with the average temperature being about 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Therefore, in my honest opinion, that, well, Cryolophosaurus probably would have been fighting to keep as much of that insulation as possible and was likely to have feathers. Probably not as much as I'm, well, showing here, however, but considering this is Canada and it's minus 25, I figured the extra insulation would do him some good. At any rate, I'm now going to leave you off with the beauty shots here. Took it in my backyard at minus 25. So that's part of the reason I wanted to make this Arctic dinosaur, obviously, mainly because we share a very similar climate. Perhaps, well, Canada's a little colder than what he is used to, but we gave him a bit of an extra jacket just for the occasion. So, hopefully you enjoyed the video. This did take quite a bit longer than expected, given the fact that, well, I'm not posting this on the weekend, and we'll be returning back to my Jurassic Lego project. So, be sure to stay tuned for that. I will have a supercut of a dragon coming out soon, so you can binge watch all of the dragon content that I've recently produced, and then we'll be returning back to some stop motion projects. So be sure to keep an eye on for the shorts and the photo countdown. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed the video, and be sure to hit that like button if you did. Leave a comment below what you think of the project, and perhaps make a suggestion for the next dinosaur. And if you're new and were inspired and perhaps just enjoy this type of content, be sure to subscribe so that way you don't miss any of the new videos that I work on, because this stuff takes quite a long time and this project literally took me almost 3 weeks. And, well, the dragon took a lot longer. So, at any rate, be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed the content, comment below what you think, share with your friends, and perhaps consider subscribing if you're new. At any rate, that's enough from me. Till next time, take it easy.